Under Plum Lake by Lionel Davidson. Part 2, Under the Sea, 10, The Stone Brain. He said we were made of the sea. He said almost 3/4 of our bodies were liquid, and that our blood and our sweat and our tears were salty because the sea was salty. He said that everything came from the sea. Everything had started there, and life on the globe was in just a thin skin around the edge, like the skin of an apple. He said that the skin was in 3 layers, and the exposed outer one, where the mountains jutted out of the sea, was the world of the mountain dwellers. At its highest point, it was only 5.5 miles high. This was Mount Everest, and even that was too high for any life. There was little life above 4 miles. Jet planes rarely flew higher than 6, so this was the narrowest and meanest layer. Below it was the sea, and this was 7 miles deep, with mountains higher than Everest, and life in every part of it. He said creatures on other planets thought Earth was mainly water, with the life in it mainly water life, and this was true because water covered 2/3 of it. Not only that, there was more of everything underwater. There were more creatures and vegetable life. There were more materials and chemicals, more oil, coal, gold, food, everything, which made sense because things didn't just start in the sea, but also ended there. He said that dozens of times mountain ranges had built up from the sea, and life and civilizations had formed on them, and dozens of times they'd worn down again and returned to the sea as dust. And over millions of years, the dust and sediment had formed into sedimentary rock and pushed up into the mountains, and the whole process had restarted. He said that in the last 500 million years alone, this had happened 6 times, although by then the people had gone to Egon. I'm trying to keep it simple. It wasn't simple when he said it. It's only a fraction of what he said. Most of what he said I couldn't understand. There weren't any words to make me understand. He said my brain wasn't big enough, and it never would be. He said it was like trying to tell a dog. He said he'd done all this stuff himself when he was 60, years before when his brain was ready. He said his sister hadn't started yet because hers wasn't ready. All their 18-year-old baby could do so far was play the violin. I know it looks mad. I thought I was mad. I found I wasn't later, but I can't stop now. I've got to keep going. He said that the land above the sea used to be one continent. There was no Asia, Europe, Africa, America, Australia. They were joined, and the climate was good, and everything grew bigger in it. There weren't grotesque things like huge flying beasts. They came later, with even weirder creatures. After the mess-up, thousands of different forms came later and passed out of existence. At this early time, with conditions stable for millions of years, all life on the continent developed fully. There were more apes and man-like creatures, but man was the most intelligent. There were no black men or yellow men or white men. All were brown in the same build and appearance, and they controlled life on the planet. At this time, nuclear energy, he only mentioned because I asked him, was already buried far into the past. It was as ancient as the discovery of fire. He said that for ages there had been flights to the stars, and I've got to interrupt again because of what I put earlier about the impossibility of reaching the stars and how the speed of light was the fastest thing in the universe, and it would take too long. He just looked at me when I said it. He didn't know how to explain it to me. He said, could I remember what my bedroom looked like at home? I said I could. He said, could I remember where I put my watch in the cave? I said I could. He said, in that cave, a part of me had already moved faster than the speed of light. He said it was a question of using that part. He said the first 25 years at school were spent just learning the idea of it. It was as basic as reading and writing. It was as basic as the difference between brain and mind. I said, what was the difference between brain and mind? And again, he looked at me and hardly knew what to say. He said it was obvious what the difference was. He said you got people with identical brains, but you couldn't get them with identical minds. Making a brain work was what produced mind. Brain was a basic thing like stone. I don't want to go on, but ideas keep coming back. He said if you blew up a balloon and drew a map of the world on it and let the balloon down, you'd see not only all the continents came together more or less as they used to, but that what they used to be was the shape of a brain. He said so many things. He gave me the look you give a dog when it can't understand. He said we'd skip it, he'd tell me more about Egon. He said we'd skip it and he'd tell me about Egon. He said millions of years ago, science had become so advanced that they needed a better power source than the sun. The sun was too tiny a star for the power they needed. In exploring the universe, they'd found many stars more useful than the sun. The idea was to pick one with a suitable planet and move there. But the problem was to find a planet as suitable as Earth. Earth was the finest and most beautiful planet anywhere, so a different idea was developed. Instead of finding another planet, they decided to shift the Earth. They'd focus all they could of the sun's energy and use it to launch Earth into a different star system. There were disputes about it for generations, and it was difficult. It meant making changes to replace the gap left by Earth in the solar system. But it was possible, so they did it. They did it and failed. And that was the mess up, he said. He said it started with a gigantic lurch, which shifted the equator and made it into the North and South poles. It split up the whole continent of land, and it split up the foundation underneath. He said the foundation was the third layer of the Earth's skin, the crust. He said that this layer was thicker than the other two layers put together. It was 30 miles deep. It supported everything on top, the sea and the land. When it split into 6 main plates. One carried away North and South America, another carried most of Asia, Europe, and part of the Atlantic, another carried the whole Pacific Ocean, and so on. And a crazy cycle of weather changes began, ice ages, tropical ages, then ice ages again, as if the great stone brain had gone mad when it split. But before they'd taken everything they needed from on top and gone down to Egon. Egon had been discovered long before, and he was just telling me how, when Murrah began roaring and said his father was in the projector. We were in the room by that time, and she switched the projector on there too. A girl came through it and told him to wait. Then she looked around the room and went. Dido licked his lips nervously. He said, "Barry, I'd better say goodbye now. He might erase you himself. He can come in and do that. He can do everything like that. But don't say a thing. It's just, I wanted to show you everything. Egonia, the fantastic city, and Mount Julius and Plum Lake. Well, goodbye." He was patting my head, and I didn't know whether to pat his. I didn't know how you said goodbye here. I just said awkwardly, "Goodbye," when the projector glowed again and a man was there. He was speaking to someone beyond us, and the girl we'd seen was putting papers on his desk. He was a stern-faced man. He didn't bother coming in the room. He just stayed where he was and looked straight at us. I felt Dido almost shrivel beside me, and he tried to say something, but the man cut him off and spoke a few sentences more. Then his face seemed to soften, and I looked at Dido's and saw a look of surprise and delight come over it. He began speaking, but the man just gave him a nod, and the projector went dead. "Oh boy," Dido cried. "Oh, Egon. What is it? There's a storm up there. They've made inquiries. No one can get to that cave. They won't be able to get to it for 3 days. You can stay. You can come home with me." He was pulling my ears and patting my head. And that's how it happened. It's how I came to see it. It's how I remember what I'm not supposed to remember. And that's the end of the 10th section.